The massive halls of Galactic University buzzed with activity as students from 100 different worlds hurried to their classes. Among them walked 5 young aliens who would soon learn why the universe feared humanity's knowledge of war. Zix, a tall blue-skinned creature with 4 arms, led his study group into Professor Cathax's Sinanthropology classroom. Behind him followed Valra, whose crystalline body sparkled under the artificial lights. Mean, a small floating blob of intelligent gas. Torque, a reptilian being with scales that changed color with his mood. And Plix, who looked like a walking plant with eyes on its leaves. Today, Professor Cathax announced to the class, his tentacles waving with excitement, "You will begin your most important assignment of the year." The professor's 8 eyes blinked in sequence as he looked around the room. "You will study why humans maintain such large military forces, despite rarely using them in conflicts." Torque's scales turned yellow with confusion. "Professor, why study humans? They're one of the younger species in the Federation. Surely the older races would be more interesting." Professor Cathax made a sound that resembled a laugh. "Ah, Torque, that's exactly the kind of thinking that makes this study necessary. You see, humans joined the Federation only 50 years ago, but their understanding of warfare has already changed how we think about peace." The professor touched a button on his desk, and a hologram appeared in the center of the room. It showed Earth's military bases, weapons factories, and defense systems. "Look at all this," he said, pointing with one tentacle. "Humans spend huge amounts of resources maintaining these facilities, yet in their 50 years of Federation membership, they have never started a single war." Valra raised her crystalline hand. "Maybe they're just afraid of fighting stronger species." "An excellent hypothesis," the professor replied, "but incorrect. In fact, during the Krix invasion 10 years ago, human forces helped defend 12 different worlds. They clearly aren't afraid of fighting. The question is, why do they try so hard to avoid it?" Zix wrote everything down in his data pad, his 4 hands working together to capture every detail. "So what exactly is our assignment, Professor?" "Your group will spend the next month studying human military history. You will have access to their historical archives, permission to interview human veterans, and use of our simulation chambers." Professor Cathax's voice grew serious. "But I must warn you, what you find may change how you view not just humans, but the very nature of war itself." As the students left the classroom, Mean floated nervously next to his friends. Did anyone else notice how the professor seemed almost scared when he talked about human warfare? Plix rustled her leaves thoughtfully. "That's silly. Humans look so harmless. What could possibly be scary about them?" Little did they know, they were about to find out exactly why even the most powerful species in the galaxy thought twice before provoking humanity into conflict. The 5 friends agreed to meet in the library the next morning. None of them realized that their simple research assignment would soon reveal one of the galaxy's most important lessons. Sometimes the most peaceful species are the ones who understand war too well to ever want it. The university's historical archives were housed in a giant crystalline structure that reached into the purple sky. Zix and his friends stood before the massive entrance, their access cards ready. "Remember," Valra said, her crystal body reflecting the morning light, "we're looking for information about human wars." Inside, they found the human history section surprisingly large. Torque's scales turned green with surprise when he saw the wars and conflicts subsection took up nearly a quarter of the space. "Let me handle the archive interface," Mean suggested, his gaseous form connecting with the computer system. The holographic screen lit up, and suddenly the room filled with images that made them all freeze. The first recording showed something called World War I. They watched in horror as humans fought in muddy trenches, poison gas floating across battlefields. Young soldiers, barely adults, charged through walls of bullets. The archive listed the dead, millions upon millions. "This can't be right," Plix whispered, her leaves trembling. These humans were killing their own species. Before anyone could answer, the next recording started. World War I. They saw cities reduced to ash from the sky, machines called tanks crushing everything in their path, and then something that made even Professor Kthax, who had just entered, turn away. Nuclear weapons. Two suns, Zix said quietly, watching mushroom clouds rise over human cities. They created artificial suns to destroy themselves. Torque's scales had turned white with fear. Professor, why would they do this? Professor Kthax moved his tentacles slowly, thoughtfully. Keep watching. The most important part comes next. The next recording showed something called the Cold War. Unlike the previous conflicts, this one showed no battles. Instead, they watched as humans built enough weapons to destroy their entire planet many times over. I don't understand, Valera said. They built all these weapons but didn't use them. That's exactly the point, Professor Kthax explained. Humans invented something called mutually assured destruction. They realized their weapons had become too powerful. If they fought another major war, everyone would die. So they chose not to fight. Mean floated closer to the screen. But Professor, why didn't they just get rid of the weapons? Because humans understood something that most species never learn, the professor replied. Sometimes the best way to prevent war is to remember exactly why you don't want one. The group spent hours watching more recordings. They saw smaller conflicts, peacekeeping missions, and humanitarian interventions. With each viewing, they began to understand. Humans hadn't given up war because they were weak. They had given it up because they were too good at it. As they left the archives that evening, none of them spoke. Each was thinking about how their own species had never developed weapons powerful enough to destroy themselves. They had never needed to learn the wisdom that comes from staring into the abyss and choosing to walk away. The university's gardens were famous across the galaxy for their beauty, but the 5 students weren't there to admire the flowers. They had come to meet James Chen, the human groundskeeper who was also a veteran of Earth's last major conflict. They found him tending to a patch of roses, his gray hair shining in the sunlight. When Zix explained their assignment, the old man's eyes grew distant, as if looking at something far away. You want to know about war? James said, pulling out an old leather book from his work bag. This was my grandfather's diary from what we called World War I. It's better than any history lesson. The group sat on benches while James opened the worn pages. Mean created a small anti-gravity field to hover closer, his gaseous form condensing slightly with concentration. April 15, 1945. James read. Today we found another camp. I won't write what we saw inside. Some horrors shouldn't be remembered, but we must never forget they happened. Torque's scales shifted to a deep blue of sadness. Why keep such painful memories? James looked up from the diary. Because forgetting makes it easier to repeat mistakes. My grandfather's generation saw the worst of humanity. My father's generation lived under the threat of nuclear war. My generation, we were the first to grow up truly understanding what war could cost us. Valra's crystalline form sparkled as she asked, but other species have wars. Why are human wars different? Because, James said, turning more pages, humans don't just fight wars. We study them. We perfect them. Every new technology we create, our first thought is often, how could this be used in war? It's not something we're proud of, but it's part of who we are. He showed them pictures from the diary, hand-drawn sketches of weapons, battle plans, and faces of fallen friends. Each page told stories of innovation born from desperation, of humans pushing the limits of what was possible just to survive one more day. The real reason we avoid wars now, James continued, closing the diary gently. It's not because we're peaceful by nature. It's because we know exactly how far we'll go if we're pushed. Every human child learns about our wars, not to glorify them, but to understand the price of starting one. Plix's leaves quivered. That sounds like a heavy burden to carry. It is, James agreed. But it's also our greatest strength. When you truly understand war, you work harder for peace. That's why the Federation often asks for human peacekeepers. We don't just see two sides fighting. We see all the ways things could go wrong, because we've been there before. As they left the garden, Professor Cathax's words echoed in their minds. They were beginning to understand why studying humans was so important. It wasn't their technology or their strength that made them unique. It was their memory and their determination to learn from it. The university's simulation chamber was a massive sphere of pure energy, designed to recreate any scenario with perfect accuracy. Today, it would show the alien students something they'd never forget. Everyone ready? Professor Cathax asked, his tentacles working the control panel. The 5 students nodded, their neural interfaces connecting them to the simulation system. The world around them shifted, and suddenly they weren't in the university anymore. They stood on what humans called a jungle battlefield in something called Vietnam. This is what humans call guerrilla warfare, the professor explained. Watch carefully. They observed as human soldiers moved through dense vegetation, setting traps, creating hidden tunnels, and fighting in ways that seemed completely illogical to alien minds. Instead of facing their enemies directly, they struck from shadows and disappeared. But this isn't honorable combat. Torque protested, his scales turning orange with confusion. Humans didn't care about honor in war, Professor Cathax replied. They cared about winning. The simulation changed. Now they stood in something called Stalingrad. They watched as humans fought for every building, every room, every inch of ground. When they couldn't fight with weapons, they fought with bricks and bare hands. Valra's crystalline form trembled. They're fighting in their own destroyed city. Why not surrender? Because humans discovered something terrible, the professor said quietly. They learned that sometimes, the more horrible the battle, the more determined they became. The scene shifted again. This time, they saw modern human warfare. Precision strikes, cyber attacks, and psychological operations. Weapons that could hit targets from orbit, soldiers who could fight in perfect darkness, and machines that could think faster than organic brains. Mean's gaseous form swirled anxiously. This isn't just fighting. This is art. They turned war into a science. Exactly, Professor Cathax said. Most species develop 1 or 2 ways of fighting. Humans, they developed thousands. Then they studied each one, improved it, and learned its weaknesses. Plix raised a leaf in question. Is this why the Federation values human military advisors so much? Yes, the professor answered. Because humans don't just know how to fight wars. They know every possible way a war could be fought. And more importantly, they know how each type of war ends. As the simulation faded, Zix used all 4 hands to take notes. So when humans say they want peace, they speak from experience. Professor Cathax finished. They've explored every dark corner of warfare, mapped every path to victory, and decided that none of them are worth the cost. 5 weeks into their research, the students gathered in the university's central library, surrounded by holographic displays of their findings. What they discovered had changed them forever. Look at this data, Zix said, his 4 hands gesturing at different charts. Every spacefaring species developed advanced weapons. But humans are the only ones who created thousands of different combat styles, then actively chose not to use them. Valra projected a timeline through her crystalline body. They went from fighting with metal sticks to nuclear weapons in less than 500 years. Most species take thousands of years to make similar advances. That's not even the strangest part, Mean floated excitedly. They turned their war knowledge into peacekeeping strategies. Look at these Federation reports. The reports showed human peacekeepers resolving conflicts across the galaxy. But unlike other species who use strength or authority, humans used understanding. They could predict how conflicts would escalate because they'd seen it all before. Torque's scales shifted to deep purple with realization. They're not just avoiding war, they're actively preventing it. Remember what James told us. Plix rustled her leaves thoughtfully. Humans carry their war memories like a burden. but they used that burden to help others avoid the same mistakes. Professor Kthax entered the library, his tentacles carrying more data crystals. You're beginning to understand. But there's one more thing you haven't considered. Why do humans maintain their military if they hate war so much? The students thought about this. Finally, Zix spoke up. Because they know if they forget how to fight, they might forget why they chose peace. Precisely, the professor nodded. Their military isn't just for defense. It's a living memorial. Every soldier, every ship, every training exercise reminds them of the cost of conflict. The displays showed human military bases across Earth. But now, the students saw them differently. These weren't preparations for war. They were monuments to peace. It's like they're standing guard, Valra said softly, not just against enemies, but against their own worst instincts. As they compiled their research, a clear picture emerged. Humans weren't peaceful because they were weak. They were peaceful because they understood war better than any species in the galaxy. They had mastered the art of fighting, then chosen to become masters of prevention instead. No wonder the Federation values them so highly, Min observed. They're not just allies. They're teachers. They had discovered humanity's greatest paradox, a species so good at war that they had become the galaxy's greatest defenders of peace. The emergency alarms blared through Galactic University's halls. 2 Federation species, the silicon-based Krath and the methane-breathing Orcs, had started positioning warships near the campus over a territorial dispute about a nearby asteroid belt. All students returned to their dormitories, the announcement echoed. But Zix and his friends ran towards the administrative building instead, where Federation diplomats were failing to resolve the crisis. We need to find James, Valra said as they rushed through the corridors. They found the human groundskeeper already heading to the diplomatic chamber, his old military uniform now replacing his usual work clothes. Inside the chamber, ambassadors from both species were shouting threats. The Krath ambassador's crystalline form pulsed with angry red light, while the Vork's representative's atmospheric suit bubbled with agitation. James stood quietly at the back until the Federation mediator noticed him. "Ah, veteran Chen. Perhaps you can offer perspective." The old groundskeeper walked to the central hologram showing both fleets. Without speaking, he pressed several buttons on the display console. New images appeared, Earth's historical battles. "Before you start shooting," James said calmly, "let me show you how a war like this usually ends." For the next hour, he displayed conflicts from human history that matched their current situation. He showed them how similar disputes had escalated, how both sides always believed they could win quickly, and how both sides always lost more than they gained. "Look familiar?" he asked, showing the asteroid belt. "These resources you're fighting over, they'll be worthless once your trade routes are disrupted. Your economies will suffer. Civilian ships will avoid this sector, all for rocks that you could share." The ambassadors grew quiet as James methodically laid out every way their conflict could unfold, using Earth's history as proof. The students watched in amazement as their groundskeeper turned teacher, using humanity's painful lessons to prevent new ones. Finally, the Krath ambassador spoke. "Perhaps we could discuss a joint mining operation. Our atmospheric requirements are different anyway," the Vork's representative added. "We could work different shifts." As the diplomats began discussing cooperation instead of combat, Professor Kthax gathered his students. "Now you understand," he whispered. "This is why humans make the best peacekeepers. They don't just hope for peace. They can show you exactly why you want to avoid war." The crisis ended not with battlefield glory, but with mining permits and trade agreements. To the students, it was the most impressive victory they had ever witnessed. The university's grand auditorium was packed with students, professors, and even several Federation diplomats. Zix and his team stood on stage, ready to present their findings about humanity's relationship with war. "When we started this research," Zix began, all 4 hands gesturing at the holographic display, "we thought humans maintained their military because they expected war. We were wrong. Valora stepped forward, her crystal form projecting historical images. Humans don't prepare for war because they want it. They prepare because they remember it. The display showed scenes from their research, the archived footage, James's grandfather's diary, the simulation results. Each image told part of the story of humanity's journey from warriors to peacekeepers. Most species, Torque explained, his scales shifting to scholarly blue, develop warfare until they achieve dominance. Humans developed it until they understood its futility. Mean floated above the stage, creating a gas-form diagram. They turned their weapons into warnings, their armies into advisors, and their war stories into peace lessons. Plix gestured to James, sitting in the front row. Our groundskeeper showed us that humans carry their history like a shield, protecting others from repeating their mistakes. The audience watched as they played footage from the recent crisis. Many gasped as they realized how close their sector had come to war, and how simply it had been prevented, not with threats or shows of force, but with understanding. Humans don't avoid war because they're afraid, Zix concluded. They avoid it because they respect it. They know its cost, its consequences, and most importantly, its alternatives. Professor Cathax took the stage after their presentation. This research reveals something profound. The Federation doesn't value humans because they're the strongest, fastest, or most advanced species. We value them because they've done something no other species has managed. They've mastered war by choosing peace. The applause was interrupted by James walking onto the stage. In his hands, he carried his grandfather's diary. "If you learn anything from humans," he said, opening the worn book, "learn this. A weapon's true power isn't in its ability to destroy, but in its ability to remind us why we choose not to." As the audience rose in a standing ovation, the 5 students realized they'd learned humanity's greatest lesson. Sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who fight hardest for peace.